From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz is back, this time touting the practice of plant tissue testing for nutrient content. He'll look at the value of that test information for diagnosing crop problems and for making in-season nutrient management decisions. Then, from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen will review 2 new court rulings on agriculture-related matters, including that court decision which halted the USDA's proposal to forgive the debt held by socially disadvantaged farmers on USDA loans. Further ahead, with another Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus Vander Hoeven, and more, here on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Thanks once more for tuning in. On this segment, an approach to crop nutrient analysis that you may or may not have tried, producers, but it's proven a valuable asset when coming to nutrient management decisions. What we're discussing here is plant tissue testing. And telling us about the process, what it will inform you about as producers, is Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. He's a crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension, and has been a proponent of this in the past. Shares some more on it now. What is meant directly, Dorivar, by plant tissue testing?
Yes, Eric, this is an excellent tool that we have basically for nutrient management. Essentially, in season, we are evaluating what's the nutrient status of crops and focusing on corn in particular. Obviously, we do have some guidelines and some things that we need to keep in mind to make sure we're getting good information and ultimately make decisions based on this information that we're getting. Some of the key things to keep in mind with nutrient tissue testing is basically the sampling guidelines. And this is something that's very important for any crops. Basically, once we get samples in the lab and we get results, these nutrient values are going to be compared basically to book values, if you will. That's going to be reference values. And the growth stage information and how we are collecting the samples is going to be key information here for the lab, as well as once we get it back, the analysis, and for producers to interpret that or agronomists looking at the values. In the case of corn in particular, if we're thinking about during the growing season, we really have 3 different timings and plant parts, if you will, that you need to pay attention to. Typically for plants that are less than 12 inch tall, we usually will want to collect the whole plant and basically send in the whole plant for analysis to the lab. Once the plant is taller and is getting above 12 inches, we usually tend to focus on the upper fully developed leaves, and so we're basically collecting those upper leaves, multiple leaves across the field. And again, you have to keep in mind, just like soil sample, we're trying to collect random samples across the field to basically have some representative number for that particular field. Now, once we get to the reproductive stage in corn, we basically focus on what we call the ear leaves. The leaves that's basically right below the ear, that's the reproductive stage. So we want to collect that, again, multiple leaves, and send that to the lab. And so those are key plant parts that we need to keep in mind as we're thinking about the growing season. Because, again, these are going to be compared to standard values, and we want to make sure we are providing that information.
And you say that what one can do here is use this in 2 ways, as a diagnostic tool or, as you noted, to monitor nutrient status.
That's correct, Eric, and this is very important also, and it has implications for how we are collecting that sample and how we interpret the values. And in the first case where we're talking diagnostic, is basically when you go to the field and you see parts of the field that's yellow or maybe some type of stress that we don't know, we're trying to find out what it is, and parts of the field that looks okay. And so in this case, it's really a diagnostic situation where we're trying to find out what the problem is. Oftentimes, that could be a nutrient situation. And so in that kind of situation, we don't worry too much about what plant part you are collecting. It could be the whole plant, it could be specific leaves. but we basically need to collect plants from the good areas and from the bad areas. So again, if you are in the field, you have yellow spots, you want to obviously collect samples from there, and similar sample plant parts from parts of the field that looks good. And so once we get those to the lab, we basically analyze those for multiple nutrients potentially and see what's the difference between these two different areas. And so this is helping us to find out what's the limiting factor. If it is a nutrient, then tissue test is going to tell us what's the difference between that good and bad areas. So this is the first case, which is diagnostics, which really is in my opinion, one of the best use of tissue analysis, because it's, again, give us the possibility of comparing areas and basically immediately basically show up. If it is a nutrient problem, typically that difference is going to show up there. And then the next situation is really essentially to monitor the nutrient status of the crop, and if possible, make adjustments. In some nutrients, and depending on the growth stage, we may be able to make adjustments. That's not always the case. However, this piece of information can be useful as we are developing perhaps future nutrient management programs. If we are seeing consistently lower values, for example, for certain nutrients, then we probably need to be thinking about some adjustments here for the future. And again, like I say, in some cases, we may be able to do something about it during this season, especially for nutrients like, for example, movonutrients, like early in the season for nitrogen, for sulfur, where we can perhaps do a citrus application and fix the problem. In that case, it's really more of a nutrient monitoring situation, and in this case, obviously, we need to follow those guidelines that I mentioned in terms of specific plant parts, make sure we follow those. It's important to highlight that nutrient concentration in different plant parts and different growth stages is going to be different. And so we need to keep in mind that piece of information in terms of how we interpret that value for nutrient monitoring purpose.
As far as handling those samples, anything specific that's necessary here to make sure that a quality sample is being submitted?
That's an excellent point also, Eric. And there's really some key points we need to keep in mind here for how we handle the samples. Ultimately, what's going to happen once the sample gets to the lab is that we'll basically dry the samples. So typically, any way that we can start that process of drying essentially in the farm or in the during shipment is always a good approach. So we typically recommend paper bags, and so try to avoid plastic, because plastic will not allow for that moisture to basically release. And so we want to use paper bags that will basically start the process of drying those samples. If we are not able to send it to the lab right away, we can essentially let the sample dry already in the farm and send it with lower moisture. Or otherwise, again, typically once we use paper bags, we get already some level of moisture loss when we get to the lab. And so that's key information. Obviously, provide all the details to the lab in terms of growth stages and make sure that information is included, so we get some good interpretations back as well to the producer.
Well, then one submits a sample, goes through the steps that you mentioned here, does it properly, receives results back. What do they have in hand? How does one interpret that information?
Yes, and a little bit depends on what nutrient we're talking about and what is the purpose primarily of this of the analysis. And in Kansas, we have to keep in mind what are going to be typically the most common limiting nutrients. And again, we typically talk about the macronutrients, N, P, and K. Those are going to be on top of the list, so we need to watch those very closely. There's also some micronutrients, and tissue testing can do a good job at determining some of those micronutrients that may be limited. But again, in Kansas, I will definitely focus on the main nutrients. Again, going back on the purpose of these, if we are looking at diagnostic, obviously we want to compare those good areas and bad areas and trying to determine the limiting nutrients. Also, we do, most labs will provide interpretations in terms of what's considered to be a common optimum range. And this is a little bit what would be equivalent to the medical profession, where we may be getting lab analysis and it give you a range of values that will be considered a healthy plan, a productive plan. We want to be as close as possible to that range. Now, one thing I want to emphasize here is that just because we are getting values slightly below that range doesn't mean that we necessarily need to do fertilizer applications immediately. We need to keep in mind that many other factors will be affecting interpretation of that tissue analysis. factors like stress in the plant, drought, insect, pests, any type of stress on that plant is going to be affecting the concentration of nutrients. So this is where the producer and the agronomist will have to interpret this accordingly. We need to look at the results from the lab, but at the same time, connect this back to that specific situation in the field. How was the situation during sampling time? Did we have perhaps saturated soils that may be affecting nutrient uptake? And so it's basically one piece of information that needs to be included in the whole picture. It's a little bit risky sometimes to just look at the lab analysis and immediately make decisions, assuming that we are limited in certain nutrients. Because again, it is possible that we have plenty of those nutrients in the soil, but the question is why the plant is not taking up those nutrients. And so again, it is one piece of information like others that we need to include in our decision making.
That said, it can be a highly valuable, informative source that you producers can lean on. And the soil testing laboratory here at K-State can receive such tissue samples for analysis.
Yes, Eric, we will also provide that to producers across the U.S. And so, yes, that definitely one opportunity for producers to take advantage of that. Can work very closely with our county agents to do that.
Touch base with your local extension agricultural agent. They can help you with further guidance on sampling. Again, these are tissue samples from standing crops and submitting those samples to K-State for analysis. And thanks for coming over and pointing this out to us as an alternative that producers can utilize in tracking what's happening with their growing crops out there in the nutrient sense. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That from Research and Extension Crop Nutrient Specialist Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, talking of plant tissue testing. We'll be back with more for you on Agriculture Today. Stay with us. Agriculture Today returns now on the K-State Radio Network. Well, if you've been watching closely of late, there's been quite a run of developments in the courts that are noteworthy, to say the least, to farmers and ranchers and all of agriculture. And we want to highlight those now as we're visiting once again with Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation out of the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen. Well, Roger, let's begin with this one. It most definitely has been high profile of late. It was one phase of what they're calling the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. And this expressly went into loan forgiveness for those holding USDA loans and has caused, obviously, a bit of a stir.
Well, indeed it has. It's a lengthy piece of legislation, and Section 1005 of that act directs the Ag Secretary to pay up to 120% of the outstanding debt that was in existence by a debtor as of January 1 of 2021 of a socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher. In other words, they're going to get not only their existing amount forgiven, but 20% in addition to that forgiven. But they have to meet the definition of a socially disadvantaged farmer or rancher to qualify. And the way they define that is as a person that's a member of a socially disadvantaged group, which is defined in turn as a group whose members have been subjected to racial or ethnic prejudice because of their identity as members of a group without regard to their individual qualities. Well, in short, what that means is that loan forgiveness, that whole program is based entirely on race of the farm or ranch borrower.
Mm-hmm. And rather swift and direct as far as the payoff of outstanding loans held by socially disadvantaged producers?
Yeah, that's right. On its website, USDA said that eligible direct loan borrowers would start receiving debt relief letters from FSA in the mail on a rolling basis starting the week of May 24, and they would review eligible borrowers, and they should then sign a letter which, when they receive it, and return it to FSA. And USDA said earlier in June that they would begin to process those signed letters for payments. And about 3 weeks after a signed letter is received, the socially disadvantaged borrower that qualified would then be eligible for their existing loan balances to be paid and get a payment of 20% on top of that of their total qualified debt by direct deposit, which then they can use for tax liabilities, other fees associated with the payment of the debt. And Congress allocated about $3.8 billion to the program.
So the stage was set for this to be rolled out, but intervening was a court challenge on constitutional grounds. Talk about what's happened there.
Well, that's right. There were 12 white farmers from 9 states that sued and said this is racially discriminatory. They sought a preliminary injunction. And the federal district court in Wisconsin just a few days ago said that's absolutely right. They would suffer irreparable harm without the issuance of a restraining order. They didn't have traditional legal remedies, and they had a great likelihood of success on the merits. And the court said that USDA didn't have any compelling interest for the racial classifications of the loan forgiveness program. They failed to target any specific episode of past or present discrimination, and that USDA had no evidence of intentional discrimination in the implementation of recent ag subsidies and pandemic relief efforts. And so that was the argument USDA was trying to make. Well, we're making up for the discriminatory practices of prior virus-related legislation. The court said, you don't have any evidence of that, USDA. And so the court said USDA failed to establish that it had any compelling interest in remedying the effects of past and present discrimination by distributing benefits on the basis of racial classifications. Therefore, violates the Constitution, did not provide equal protection under the law to all farm and ranch borrowers, regardless of what the court said, are immutable characteristics. You can't do that. The court said that the plaintiffs here were excluded from the program based on their race, and so they were experiencing discrimination at the hands of the government. And so the court entered a temporary restraining order. It'll proceed through the process. That will move to an injunction, and then as it proceeds through, I would expect that the program will be eliminated due to constitutional defects. At least that's what the federal district court indicated would happen.
But that's where it stands today, pending that preliminary injunction. So
that's correct.
There will be more information to come on this, undoubtedly, in the relative near future. Well, there was a ruling made in the state of Iowa, which does have repercussions beyond that state for sure. This had to do with water resources in that state and environmental interests filing suit to attempt to cut off certain runoff events from agricultural lands.
Yeah, this has been going on for a number of years in Iowa. The last 10 years or so, this has been an issue. Various aspects of it have gone through the court system in Iowa, but the most recent decision just came down last Friday by the Iowa Supreme Court. What is involved here is you've got some social groups that are focused on environmental justice and social justice, as they call it. And so they sued the state of Iowa and various state officials and agencies that are associated with ag and environmental protection. And they claimed that the so-called public trust doctrine required the state and these agencies to enact legislation and promulgate rules that would force farmers to adopt farming practices that would significantly reduce levels of nitrogen and phosphorus runoff into the Raccoon River that flows through central Iowa. And they claimed that such a requirement imposed by the court would improve their members' feelings by enhancing aesthetics and recreational uses of the river and by reducing their members' water bills. And so they brought the suit, and they wanted an injunction requiring the state to adopt and implement a remedial plan to limit the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in the river. They were claiming that the legislature has not done enough. The Ag Department has not done enough. The Department of Environmental Protection has not done enough to prevent these problems, and so they brought their claims to court.
The trial court initially hearing this case didn't allow the defendant's motion to dismiss the case. It actually moved up several notches to the state Supreme Court then at that point. And its decision, as you said, came down late last week. What did that court have to say?
The Supreme Court reversed the trial court, and they said, in short, although it's a very long opinion, but in short, they said, look, this is a policy issue. The legislature deals with policy issues. We do not. You do not have a claim that you can bring to us. In fact, you don't have any remedy that we can give you. All you're basically asking us for is an advisory opinion, and we don't issue advisory opinions. We are not going to expand, the court said, the public trust doctrine, at least the majority of the court. There were dissents. But the majority said we are not about to expand the public trust doctrine to obliterate the legislature, and that's not our role. And so they dismissed the case and ruled on behalf of the state. It is up to the voters of that state. It's up to their elected officials to deal with these issues as they deem appropriate. And the court said when you're bringing claims saying that your feelings are hurt and aesthetic values, you're claiming aesthetic values and recreational uses are impaired, the court said, well, those are different for every person that's out there, and we can't address those. That's why this is one of the reasons that this is a policy issue that's to be decided by elected officials. And so the court held firm and did not expand the public trust doctrine to say that under that rule the legislature must act. No, they said it's up to the legislature to determine when and if they will act.
More broadly, though, this public trust doctrine being used as a leverage tool in the courts, that's worth monitoring on the part of agriculture. You say that can be a rather worrisome thing here.
Yeah, it is. In fact, I wrote an article, Eric, last October called The Public Trust Doctrine, a Camel's Nose Under Agriculture's Tent. This is not something that's new. The U.S. Supreme Court's first application of the public trust doctrine was in 1842. And a lot of these early cases dealt with submerged land, and in fact, that 1842 case dealt with whether you could oyster harvest off the coast of New Jersey. In other words, who owns the waters? Is that owned in trust for the public, or can you have private oyster farming or fishing, whatever you call it, on that water? Now, the recent attempts to use this doctrine have tried to expand it to restrict or eliminate water rights for farmers that are drawing water from an underground aquifer or from a stream to water crops. They're trying to use it to allow the regulation of private property for endangered species, so forth and so on. And it's always farmers and landowners that get caught in this, and they end up having their private property rights restricted if courts expand the doctrine beyond its initial usage as defined in the 1800s by the U.S. Supreme Court. So far, largely the courts, like the Iowa court recently, have held the line and said, no, we're not going to expand it beyond its original meaning and its original application. But this is something agriculture is going to have to watch. This is something that if the courts expand it, you'll see property owners losing property rights under this notion of the public trust, that their land it's their land, but the public has certain rights associated with it. Well, if that happens, then you've just lost some of your private property rights. So we got to keep an eye on this one.
All of what we've touched upon today and much more is covered fully in Roger's blog series, which is at washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. As always, Roger, many thanks to you.
Thank you, Eric.
He is a professor of agricultural law and taxation out of the Washburn University School of Law, and our guest every other Wednesday, Roger McEowen, on Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson back with you and with today's agricultural news headlines for you now, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the latest word from our friends at Kansas Wheat harvesting is marching northward in the state. The manager of Gavilon Grain in Wichita, Alex Gerard, reported that producers were back in the field by yesterday afternoon following an inch of rain across much of Sedgwick County on Sunday that delayed harvest. Gavilon doesn't take in much wheat directly from farmers, instead taking it from area cooperatives, and harvest in that area more than half complete in Gavilon's draw area. That extends from Newton to Pratt and then to the Oklahoma border. Gerard said there have been very few issues with moisture. Test weights are averaging more than 62 pounds per bushel, and protein continues to average around 10%. The most prevalent issue, though, he says, is increased dockage. However, after the initial loads showed dockage issues, producers are now adjusting their combine settings accordingly and lowering the dockage considerably in subsequent loads. And farmers also resumed cutting late yesterday morning in Meade County toward the southwest part of the state, according to Mike Schlachtermeyer, who is the general manager at Meade Cooperative Elevator and Supply. He estimated the area roughly a third through wheat harvest, having started on June the 14th. Schlachtermeyer reporting harvested yields varying with continuous wheat, yielding around 30 bushels per, wheat planted following a fallow period from 60 to 90 bushels per acre. Despite the big swing there, the wheat has maintained a heavy test weight at more than 63 pounds per bushel on average, and protein has remained, though, below average. He also reported seeing very small and underdeveloped kernels that fall through the screen and then end up as dockage, contributing to slightly higher dockage rates than normal. And Skyland Grain's Dermott location in Stevens County, even further to the southwest, has been running consistently since last Wednesday, and the location has been pulling in quite a bit more hard white winter wheat than hard red, yields averaging 40 to 50 bushels per acre, test weights ranging from 55 to 64, and the protein for the hard white wheat is averaging between 12 and 10%. Make that for the hard red wheat. Hard white wheat is higher in protein, up to 14%. Tomorrow we'll begin our daily Kansas wheat harvest updates featuring county and district extension agricultural agents from around the state of Kansas. Republican members of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee are asking the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers now for the review the agencies said was conducted, which prompted them to conclude that the Trump administration's Navigable Waters Protection Rule needed to be repealed and replaced. The lack of transparency surrounding the decision to abandon the environmentally sound rule is disheartening. Those are the words of the lawmakers in their letter to EPA Administrator Michael Regan and Acting Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works Jamie Pickham. The lawmakers said the administration has not provided its analysis to back up their claims that the Trump-era rule caused significant environmental damage and ongoing environmental harm, and that it faced implementation challenges. They're asking for the specifics of all of that on the 333 projects that did not require a permit under the Trump rule, but would have under the Obama-era Waters of the U.S. rule. The lawmakers are seeking a response by July the 5th. As our nation's agricultural export forecasts reach record numbers, there are possible signs of continued export expansion. Here's more from the USDA's Rod Bain.
A positive year for us on trade.
With record U.S. ag exports forecasted for 2021. Yet Jason Halfmeister of USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service explained the whys to an audience at the annual American Seed Trade Association conference this week.
It's both a volume and a value story.
Meaning the forecast is for more volume and higher prices associated with export of many bulk crop commodities.
That's true on the livestock side as well. Prices are bouncing back. If you're buying meat in the grocery store, you'll notice it, but volume is also up.
Halfmeister adds, even with economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic taking place, he is confident in a continued rebound for U.S. ag exports.
We see more and more people joining the middle class. We see more and more demand for ag products, more and more demand for high quality, high value products, and that's going to create more customers for our producers.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
In other headlines today, CNH Industrial announced on Monday it had purchased ag tech leader Raven Industries in an all-cash deal that broadens the equipment manufacturer's technology offerings in automated field work, logistics, and data management, and it accelerates CNH's work in the realm of autonomous operations. The deal, which CNH hopes to close by the fourth quarter, gives Raven an implied value of $2.1 billion. The acquisition of Raven solidifies a long-time technology partnership between the two companies. CNH was already Raven's largest single customer, representing about 30% of the income earned by Raven's Applied Technology division. Well, the winners recently were recognized in the Beef Empire Days Fed Cattle Show down in Garden City, which, as Scarlett Hagens reports here, is one of the most competitive in the country.
A 1,540-pound Angus Cross steer won the Earl C. Brookover Memorial Award for the best combined finish at the Beef Empire Days Fed Cattle Show, fed at Sunbelt Feed Yard of Hugoton by Dale and Carol Voren. The entry placed first live and fourth in the carcass contest. The steer graded low prime and was a yield grade 2.85. The grand champion overall heifer was fed at HRC Feed Yards of Scott City by Shertop Angus and Charlet. This heifer weighed 1,362 pounds live, was fifth in the live show, fourth in the carcass contest, graded middle choice, and was a yield grade 1.59. JCSGP and Frank Harper fed the steer hanging the grand champion carcass at Midwest Feeders of Ingalls. The 1,678-pound steer graded low prime and was a yield grade 2.15. Sublette Feeders fed the champion carcass heifer, which was owned by Max Barkley. The heifer weighed 1,292 pounds live, graded low prime, and was a yield grade 1.75. American Hereford Association Chief Operating Officer and Director of Breed Improvement Shane Bedwell judged the live show. The carcass contest was judged by Kansas State University Meat Science Professor Travis O'Quinn. A total of 70 steers and 41 heifers competed in the event. I'm Scarlett Hagans.
And those are the lead stories on today's agricultural news page. Well, this summer marks the return of a significant outdoor event in the Flint Hills of Kansas, and Gus Vanderhoeven reflects on that next. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
The theme this year was the celebration of the Santa Fe Trail.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
It was June 12th that the celebration, Symphony in the Flint Hills, was held. This year it was close to Council Grove. Of course, on a beautiful site in the Flint Hills. We did not go. As a matter of fact, I never saw an announcement in the local paper. I did not hear about it until a friend told me a few days before. He and his wife are regulars as they help organize it. I asked him to try to obtain the field journal for me. That would be volume 13. Last year, the event was cancelled because of the pandemic. A tough decision, as so much preparation is involved. June 12th was a beautiful weekend, and Saturday evening was cool, a perfect day to celebrate. The theme this year was the celebration of the Santa Fe Trail, and the booklet which I was given tells about the Great Prairie Highway, which was started 200 years ago. As the introduction says, the Great Prairie Highway was primarily a highway of commerce. European American traders hauled United States freight westward to Santa Fe in gigantic wagons, often pulled by teams of 12 oxen. Headed in the opposite direction, the wagons of Hispanic traders transported goods from Mexico and the Southwest to eastern markets. On the inside flap of the booklet is a map of the trail from Santa Fe all the way to Boonville and Old Franklin in Missouri. It's a long trail. It was a highway with dust, dirt, and dangers. It crosses Kansas from the southwest corner to the northeast near Westport. Near Shawnee Mission, a short trail swung up north to Fort Leavenworth. Also, in the northeast was the split-off for the Oregon Trail, a trail going northwest. Studying the routing of the Santa Fe Trail, I see that it follows the Cimarron River in the southwest, and I would guess crosses the property close to the Little Rock House, close to Wagon Bed Springs. My friend Lucas writes about in his book, Running Out. To have any of these old historic trails running across your property and seeing old ruts and perhaps a landmark would give me a very special feeling. I won't call it a thrill, but much more than that. Reverence is the word I'm looking for. I would read all I could on the particular trail and would want to know as much as there was to know. In my book, I selected the one made-up story about the Alcove Springs, west of Westmoreland. I've been there several times. It always intrigues me. In western Kansas, I've sat on a rock outcrop on a hill in Cimarron National Grasslands, looking at the valley below and in front of me, through which the trail passes. When you sit there in the evening, as the sun goes down, it's awesome. But I'm only a visitor. If an old trail runs through your property, it is different, very special. Our farm is not too far from the Oregon Trail, but no trail would ever have gone across our land. It is too hilly. However, there is a shortcut, a farm trail going from the southwest corner to the northeast. I've cleared part of it, but more needs to be done to be able to walk or ride it all. It runs partly along McIntyre Creek, along the high bank and old stone walls. It dips where it crosses a draw and creek. Just before the north farm exit, it must have turned east along the old section line. There's a steep incline, and then you're on top of the hills with a 360-degree vista. You can see the storms come from far. And that takes me back to this year's field journal. On page 6, next to the foreword, stating that this year marks the 200th anniversary of the Santa Fe Trail, is a small reproduction of a painting by Phil Epp. The painting is titled Approaching Storm. It's awesome. The horizontal division of the canvas or board is about 1/8 flat hills with a slowly stretching trail with wagon ruts fading over the far hills, and the rest is 7/8 dark, ominous sky with a white cloud where the sun shines upon one more time before the sky closes. The picture in the book is only 4 by 6.5 inches, but it is powerful. I imagine myself standing on the empty prairie with the cloud formation over me. It's intimidating. I would not know where to go. There is no place to shelter. The last sun ray, which turns the white cloud white, lights up the grass in the foreground. Just a streak, and you see the trail. Beyond that, darkness, and nowhere to go but forward or stop and wait it out. You're alone with the land and the sky. The sky was and still is an ephemeral wonder. What I feel also is the stillness before the storm. The whole scene is not unfamiliar to me. I've seen it a few times before, but always could step in the relative safety of the farm truck and drive home with windshield wipers frantically going whoosh, 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 whoosh. But in the painting, Approaching Storm, I am alone and in a faraway country. The storm is coming. No mountains are as high as these clouds are.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. With that, our time is away once more. As always, thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.